This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Kaldheim there right now if you click on my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm continuing with my Kaldheim limited set review. So far, I've given my thoughts on all the white, blue, black, and red cards in the set, and today we're continuing with green. In this video, I'll evaluate every mono green card in Kaldheim for the limited format. Keep in mind, these evaluations are all being made before I've actually played with the set, so I will of course be wrong about some of the cards in this video. It is worth remembering though that generally when I am wrong, it's because I underrate a card and not overrate it. I end my discussion of each of these cards by giving them a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find an explanation of the grades in the description below. Keep in mind that in this video, I'm only talking about the limited format. That's draft and sealed, and I'm not discussing any other formats. Alright, let's look at our first green card. First, it's Arachniform, which for 1 generic and a green is a common aura with enchant creature. An enchanted creature gets +2/+2, has reach, and is every creature type. Throughout the week, we've seen lots of auras that are actually playable, and this is because they all overcome the risk of 2-for-1s one way or another, and Arachniform doesn't do that. And the bonus it grants is not significant enough for me to be interested in taking such a risk. +2/+2 reach and changeling status just don't do it for me. I will only be playing this if I'm really desperate for playables. I'm giving it a D. Next, it's Battle Mammoth, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 elephant at Mythic Rare. It's got Trample, and whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card, and it has Foretell for 2 generic and 2 green mana. This is the first time we're seeing Foretell in this video, so I'll remind you how it works. You can pay 2 generic mana to exile a card with Foretell from your hand, and then on a later turn in the game, you can cast that card for its Foretell cost. A 5 mana 6/5 Trampler is a pretty good deal, probably enough to be at least a C+ with those stats alone, but this Mammoth has 2 other really nice things going on. First, it lets you draw a card anytime a permanent is targeted by an opponent. This means that if your opponent uses removal of any kind on your board, you're going to turn the situation into a 2-for-1, and most of the time it's likely they'll go after the Mammoth since he's the source of those problems, so it is great that he includes himself in his ability. That makes his fail-case scenario into a 2-for-1. This Mammoth also has Foretell, which in this case does result in you paying more mana, 6 total instead of 5, but paying it in installments can be more appealing sometimes. Like, if you don't have anything to do on turn 2, it isn't going to hurt you to foretell this and manage to bring it down a turn earlier. All in all, this Mammoth is very good, just because he makes sure to give you value no matter what, and I think he does enough to be a bomb. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, it's Blessing of Frost, which for 3 generic and a green is a rare snow sorcery, and it says, distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures you control, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast this spell. Then draw a card for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. This seems pretty nice, but you pretty much have to be getting the snow mana going for it to be worth it. 5 mana just to draw a card for each creature you control with power 4 or greater is rough and highly situational. Even if you're drawing 2 cards with it, which is by no means guaranteed, you're still casting a really inefficient spell and not impacting the board. The great thing here, though, is if you do have snow mana, you add an immediate impact to the board while also increasing your chances of drawing more cards since your creatures will get bigger. Paying 5 mana for this, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on your board, and drawing 2 or 3 cards is a pretty darn big deal. So it does take some setup, but even just 1 counter to your whole board is reasonable enough, and I think that will be very doable. If you really get there on snow mana, it will be absolutely absurd too, so it is nice having that upside. I think this is frequently a first pickable card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Blizzard Brawl, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon snow sorcery, and it says choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. Then those creatures fight each other. So this is a strictly better Prey Upon, and Prey Upon is usually a solid but not great removal spell in the formats we've seen it in. It's like a C. Fight cards have a significant downside most other removal doesn't have. If your opponent can interact with you at all, you can end up getting blown out. There's also the fact that you need a decent number of sizable creatures to make it worth it. However, by only costing a single green mana, finding a window where you can use this one isn't too difficult. I think any green deck probably plays the first copy of this, and if you can get enough snow permanents going, it will be crazy good, as +1/+0 and indestructible is no joke. That usually means that in addition to killing something and making it harder for your opponent to interact with it, you'll also have a free attack, and that type of turn will be devastating. I want to give this a build around grade because I think the upgrade is super significant in a heavy snow deck. I'll say this is a C in a regular green deck and a B in a deck that has enough snow permanents. In those decks, this is premium removal. You probably need close to 7 or 8 snow permanents for this to somewhat consistently reach that upside. Next up, it's Boreal Outrider, who for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 elf warrior. It's a snow creature at uncommon, and whenever you cast a creature spell, if snow mana of any of that spell's colors was spent to cast it, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This seems like a really good snow payoff. On a base level, you have a 3 mana 3/2 that is a snow permanent, which isn't a bad place to start. Even if you only have one way to produce snow mana, having a couple creatures into the battlefield with an additional counter each is a great return on the 3 mana that you spent. Keep in mind that the Outrigger triggers when the creature is cast, and that means it won't do its thing for itself, just other creature spells. Also note that the mana you produce has to be colored, so if you have a snow land that's producing colorless mana, that doesn't count. It won't work for Boreal Outrider because it has to be any of that spell's colors, so colorless mana doesn't work. So be careful when you're tapping your mana. I think this is an excellent uncommon with a decent floor and a very high ceiling, and I think I'll be taking it pretty highly. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Broken Wings, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. This is a reprint, and it is always a card that you can mainboard in some situations. It hits enough different permanent types that it will have several targets against most decks, especially because this format has a ton of sagas. Still, you'd rather run removal that can more consistently deal with a wide variety of creatures, and I think this gets cut a significant amount of the time because it isn't that. It is generally going to be more useful out of the sideboard. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Elderleaf Mentor, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/2 elf warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. This is a nice common for green. Creatures who make 2 bodies are always nice, and in the end, you get a solid deal. 4 mana for 4/3 worth of stats spread across 2 bodies. It's going to be better than it looks in this set too, because going wide with elves looks to be a real strategy for black-green decks in this format, and this obviously helps you there, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Elven Beau, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon equipment, and when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 generic mana. If you do, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token, then attach Elven Beau to it. Equipped creature gets +1/+2 and has reach, and it has an equip cost of 3 generic mana. Like all the cards in this cycle, this is pretty solid. Generally, I think it's a bad plan to just straight up cast these as equipment. When you do that, the bonus you get from them is not very good. 3 to equip is rough for +1/+2 in reach. So normally you want to cast this and make the elf token, which in effect turns this into a 3 mana 2/3 with reach that, if it dies, leaves equipment behind. And in a lot of ways it's better than that, because you can move the equipment before then if there's a reason to, and even if your creature gets shut down by an aura or bounced, you still have the bow. This seems like a solid card for green decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Elvish Warmaster, who for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf warrior at rare, and when 1 or more other elves enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn, and you can pay 5 generic and 2 green, and elves you control get +2/+2 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. So this card has a very reasonable floor and an absolutely incredible upside. Most green decks in this format are likely to have like 5 elves without even trying, and the Warmaster will be happy in that type of deck. Just getting 1 extra token out of this will be a good deal. After all, he's a 2 mana 2/2. Now, if your deck can really go crazy on elves like the black-green deck, making an extra elf every turn and then utilizing the overrun ability in the late game will be insane. I think this warrants a build around grade. I'd say he's a C+ in your average green deck in the format that just has like 5 elves in it, and probably a B+ in a deck that gets there on elves. I think that means it's worth taking with the first pick a decent chunk of the time, and you won't get too burned for it if you don't get a ton of elves, so it isn't that much of a high-risk, high-reward pick. Next up, it's Isoka's Chariot, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 legendary artifact vehicle at rare. When it enters the battlefield, it creates 2 2/2 green cat creature tokens, and when it attacks, you create a token that's a copy of target token you control, and it has crew 4. 4 mana to make 2 2/2 tokens on its own is usually a decent card in limited, so everything else this does is upside, and the upside is considerable. Sure, crew 4 on a 4/4 vehicle is kind of rough, but the fact that this copies a token you control every time it attacks helps to make up for that. And keep in mind, this comes with the necessary creatures to crew it in the first place. It is still going to be a bit clunky in terms of crewing, and sometimes you just won't be able to do it. Sometimes the 2 2/2 tokens is all you'll get, But like I said, that is a decent card in most limited formats, and this has the potential to take over games on the right board. I think this is pretty good and a card you first pick most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we're looking at Finn, the Fang Bearer, who for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 human warrior at uncommon. He's also legendary, he's got Death Touch, and whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters, and a player with 10 or more poison counters loses the game. So a 2-mana 1/3 with Death Touch is actually a very good stat line. This is because it can actually block 1 and 2 drops and survive while still killing them. Then, Finn adds some crazy Death Touch upside to the mix. Death Touch combat damage to a player turning into poison counters is no small thing, though Finn, being the only creature in the set that has a poison counter ability, does make it a little less appealing. There are other ways to get Death Touch in this set, especially in green-black, so he will help you win with poison counters sometime. If you get 2 of these, things might get really silly, and at uncommon, it could still happen. Keep in mind, by the way, it doesn't have Infect, so it won't be the amount of damage makes the poison counters. It'll just be if a Death Touch creature hits them and does any amount of combat damage, they get 2 poison counters. If you get 2 of these, things could get really silly, and at uncommon, it could happen. Still, I think most of the time he'll just be a 2-mana 1/3 with Death Touch, which is a solid card, probably a C. I think the difficult to obtain poison upside is enough to bring him up to a C+, though. Next, it's Glittering Frost, which for 2 generic and a green is a snow enchantment aura at common. It has enchant land, and it says enchanted land is snow, and whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. I'm not a huge fan of this type of card. Most of these types of auras that make a land add more mana for you need to do something else to be worth it, like draw you a card, or put a +1/+1 counter somewhere, or gain you life. This doesn't do any of those things, and that means you're paying a good chunk of mana for something that doesn't immediately do anything else in most cases. Now, there are a few things that Glittering Frost has going for it. One of them is the snow theme in this set. It can give you 2 snow permanents with only a single card, and that matters for cards that count snow permanents. Additionally, because it makes the land into a snow permanent, that land can now tap for snow mana, and that also matters for several cards in this set. So I think you do end up playing this some of the time. If you need fixing and some snow stuff, you could do a lot worse. That said, I also don't think this is your ideal way of getting snow payoffs going. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Notvold Recluse, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 spider at common with reach. So most spiders we see come with low power and high toughness. This makes them good at repeatedly blocking smaller flyers, but not so good at actually killing them. Notvold Recluse is different in that it has a higher power than it does toughness. This means it's going to be better at blocking and killing larger flyers, but a lot worse at repeatedly blocking smaller flyers. 3 mana for a 4/2 is often a borderline playable card even without reach, like a D+ and a C-, and I think adding reach to the mix here means you will feel fine about playing the first copy of this, though it would be nice if it were a snow permanent or something. Anyway, I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Grizzled Outrider, which for 4 generic and a green is a 5/5 elf warrior at common, and that's it. It's a vanilla creature, and it's a reasonable one stats-wise, and it's an elf, and all of that stuff matters. There's not a whole lot more to say about this card, except it's a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Guardian Gladewalker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 shapeshifter at common. It has Changeling, which means it has every creature type, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We see versions of this card all the time, and they're always pretty nice commons for green. The +1/+1 counter into the battlefield trigger makes it so that this card is relevant all game long. Oftentimes, a single counter on the right creature is enough to enable attacks you just didn't have before, and sometimes this is just a 2-mana 2/2, like in the early game. Adding Changeling to the mix is significant upside and an already pretty good green common. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Horizon Seeker, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 human warrior at common, and it has Boast, and you can pay 1 generic and a green to search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. This is the first time we're seeing Boast in this video, so I'll remind you how it works. These are activated abilities that some creatures have that they can only use once a turn and only if they've attacked. A Boaster that lets you search up basic lands isn't too bad, especially if you're interested in splashing, or if you're interested in having snow lands in play, because it can find snow-covered basic lands as well. Since this is at common, I can imagine it really helping green decks do those things. The stats are of course underwhelming, but I think the land searching upside is enough for this to be solid at least. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Icehide Troll, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 snow creature, troll warrior at common, and you can pay 2 snow mana, and it gets +2/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn, and you tap it. This card seems fine. A 3-mana 2/3 isn't a great start, but it has a very, very real activated ability, one that your opponent will always have to respect, provided you have the snow mana lying around. This is one of those cards where just the threat of using the ability will force your opponent to play differently, either by not attacking when the troll is around or not blocking when it attacks. Something I want to clear up here, because on past set reviews people have been confused by effects like this. The tap here is not part of the cost. That means this can absolutely attack and still use the ability. The tap part is part of the effect, not the cost itself. So this seems like a fine common for green, especially in snow decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's In Search of Greatness, which for 2 green mana is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a permanent spell from your hand with converted mana cost equal to 1, plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents you control, without paying its mana cost. If you don't, scry 1. This is a weird card to evaluate. In the early game, it seems like this could be pretty potent. It would make casting 2 spells in one turn pretty easy on, say, turn 4, for example, and that could get you really far ahead. However, as the game wears on, you will run out of extra spells for this to do anything with. Now, the good news is, even if it isn't letting you cast stuff for free anymore, you do get scry 1 every turn out of it. So I feel like a game where it lets you get ahead of your opponent early, and then scries late for you is going to feel fine. When it won't be so good is when you get it late, at which point it will just be the scry. But hey, at least it still does something, unlike some cards like this. Still, I don't think this is anywhere close to a high pick. I'm very skeptical about how it'll line up in Limited, and I'm going to start it out as a C. I think if I'm wrong about this card, it probably ends up being a little bit better than I'm expecting. Next up, it's Jaspera Sentinel, which for 1 green mana is a 1/2 elf rogue at common. It's got reach, and you can tap it and tap an untapped creature you control and add 1 mana of any color. People are really going to underrate this card just because they're like, look, it costs 1 mana and it can do all sorts of stuff. The problem is the stuff it does isn't that great. We've seen a very similar card to this before, Loam Dryad for Shadows over Innistrad, a card that I overrated. This is strictly better than that because it also has reach and it also has one of the tribal creature types in the set, but I think it will perform similarly to Loam Dryad in Limited, which is to say, you should only play it if you're really desperate for fixing. Needing a second creature to tap to add the mana is no small cost. It's often hard to have that be worth it in a game of Limited, where you need to keep a creature back so it can trade or block. This set does have a 5-color sub-theme, with most of the cards that care about that at the very high rarity, and this does help with that, but we'll see how real that is in Limited. Next up, it's King Herald's Revenge, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control, and gains trample. It must be blocked this turn if able. I'm generally not a very big fan of this type of card. Sure, lure type effects are nice, but they only really get powerful if they force everything to block something, allowing the rest of your board to get through. This will require just 1 block by 1 creature. And yeah, sometimes this will make your creature absolutely massive, and adding trample to that is nice, but it still seems so clunky to me, and you have to set up the right situation. You have to have enough creatures for it to matter, and your opponent has to not have mana up, because if they do, there's a significant chance they could blow you out one way or another. A good rule of thumb in Limited is, if a card is going to be highly situational, you probably don't want to play it. I don't think I'll play this most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Kovori God of Kinship, who for 2 generic and 2 green mana is a 2/4 legendary god at rare. As long as you control 3 or more legendary creatures, Kovori gets +4/+2 and has vigilance, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and tap it to look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a legendary creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Like all the gods in this set, it is a double-faced modal card, which does not mean it's a double-faced card that transforms. It means you choose one side or the other, and that's how you cast the card. In this case, the Ringheart Crest is the other side. It's 1 generic and a green for a rare legendary artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and you can tap it to add green mana. You can spend this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type or a legendary creature spell. So, obviously enough, both sides of this card love legendary creatures, and the good news is this set has a pretty strong legendary creatures sub-theme, with several appearing at uncommon. That said, it won't be super easy to get enough legendary creatures to really abuse the god side of this card. Getting her to a 6/6 will be unlikely, but her activated ability pays you off for just having 3 or 4 legendary creatures at least, and she'll be able to draw you a card with it sometimes, even if you just have 3 in your whole deck. And that's acceptable, since she's also a 4-mana 2/4. I think it is probably kind of likely you play the artifact side of this more often, though. It is a 2-mana mana rock, and that's no joke, even if it is limited to legendary spells and creatures of a specific type you chose. It won't always line up for you. Both sides of this are a little dependent on your deck having just the right composition to really excel, but I think that's probably okay. I don't think it will be hard to get value out of either side, just don't go into it thinking you'll be able to regularly make her a 6/6 with Vigilance or something like that. I think she's first pickable a lot of the time, I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Litiara Glade Warden, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 uncommon shapeshifter. It has Changeling, and you can pay 2 generic and a green and tap it to exile a creature card from your graveyard. Then you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So it's kind of a bummer that you can't use this ability at sorcery speed, but turning creatures in the graveyard into value in the late game is pretty nice. 2 +1/+1 counters can make a significant difference on many board states, and in addition to that, it is also a changeling, so tribal synergies will make it better too. It does start out as a hill giant, but the ability is good enough to overcome that mediocre performance on the vanilla test. Overall, I think this will really be an incredible mana sink in the late game because of the value it's going to give you. Your creatures are just going to be getting larger and larger, even if you're flooding out, and that's a nice thing to have going on. I'm giving this a B-. You can first pick it in some weaker packs. Next up, it's Mammoth Growth, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn, and it has Foretell for 1 green mana. This is a solid trick. Paying the 3 mana upfront isn't the greatest deal, but the stats boost it gives is enough that it can help almost any creature win combat. The downside is the massive tempo hit you can take if your opponent can do something in response, so like with all tricks, be as careful as you possibly can when you use this. Adding Foretell to the mix does help reduce the downside a little bit, since you only pay 1 green mana the turn you actually use it, and it will give you a wider variety of windows to use the card because having 1 green mana left over is a lot easier than having 3 left over. But it is still a little too clunky for my taste to think it'll make the cut frequently enough to be a solid C. I think it's more like a C-. Next up, it's Masked Vandal, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 shapeshifter at common. It has Changeling, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or an enchantment an opponent controls. This seems fine. It's a changeling in a tribal set, which means it will be worth playing as long as it isn't completely terrible, and it really isn't. It has kind of okay stats and the ability to let you exile artifacts or enchantments. There seem to be enough of both of those for this to be main boardable most of the time, especially with the changeling upside. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Old Growth Troll, which costs 3 green mana for a 4/4 Troll Warrior at rare. It has Trample, and when it dies, if it was a creature, you return it to the battlefield. Now it's an aura enchantment with Enchant Forest you control, and it gives that forest the ability to tap and add 2 green mana, and the ability to pay 1 generic mana and tap it and sacrifice the land to create a tapped 4/4 green Troll Warrior creature token with Trample. So this is the sort of thing that it's going to be hard to cast on curve and limited because of its mana cost, but that's fine. A 4/4 Trampler is relevant for the entirety of most games, especially one that gives you some value when it dies, and this gives you a lot. A lot of the time you probably won't be particularly interested in the ramp aspect of this troll, but you will be absolutely interested in basically turning one of your lands into a 4/4. It isn't exactly a 2-for-1 because you do end up giving up a land, but a 4/4 Trampler is a huge upgrade over a land by the mid to late game especially. I think you can first pick this. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Path to the World Tree, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Then it has an activated ability that costs 2 generic mana and 1 of every colored mana, and you sacrifice Path to the World Tree, you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards, target opponent loses 2 life, Path to the World Tree deals 2 damage to up to 1 target creature, and you create a 2/2 green bear creature token. This card is a really cool design, and I'm kind of excited to see if it's possible to make it work. On a basic level, it provides you with some fixing, something you often want in Limited to splash powerful cards, and it can also search you up snowlands, which certainly matters. But as far as fixing goes, this isn't that impressive. One kind of expects to pay 1 mana to search up a basic land and put it into their hand, and this costs 2. Where it really gets interesting, though, is if you can utilize its activated ability. And obviously, it can help you do that because of the fixing it gives you. That ability is no joke. 2 cards, 2 life, a 2/2 bear, and your opponent losing 2 life and an X2 creature is really good. That's the kind of late game effect that will win you games. Now, how realistic is it to be able to play that ability? I mean, you probably shouldn't count on it, but I imagine it will be doable in some decks. I think it probably needs a build-around grade. It's probably a C- in a deck that needs fixing or to find its snowlands but can't use the activated ability, and a B- in a deck that can use it. And it's held to a B- even in those decks because even if you can use this ability, it still won't be easy. Next up, it's Ravenous Lindworm, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 worm at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. This kind of card is always solid on the top curve. Not only do you get a reasonably efficient creature, you also get 4 life, and this creature's size, combined with that life, can often be enough to help a deck stabilize even after taking a beating in the early part of the game. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Realm Walker, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 shapeshifter at rare. It has Changeling, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. You may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of your library. So this 3 mana 2/3 comes with some real upside. First, it can be whatever creature type you need it to be, and in a set with tribal stuff going on, as I've said, that's significant upside. But where it really gets sweet is when you get to cast stuff off the top of your library. Sometimes that gives you a very significant card advantage. Now, I would guess that on average, you'll get like 1 free card out of that, but that's a great deal, and sometimes it might take over games. You do have to be smart when naming creature types, but every color pair in this format sort of has a creature type it has a lot of, so it won't be that hard to build around. Plus, Changelings will be really great with this. I think this is in the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rootless U, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/4 tree folk at uncommon. When it dies, you search your library for a creature card with power or toughness 6 or greater, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. This is a strong uncommon. You get a creature that does kind of okay in the vanilla test that also replaces itself, and it will generally replace itself with something pretty beefy. That's a 2-for-1, and if you're trading this for an opposing creature of similar size and grabbing a big creature from your deck, it's going to feel great. And that's not going to be some rarity. That will just happen. Now, you do probably need at least a couple of creatures who can be searched up with this, and 3 to 4 is probably even better, but that won't be a challenge for green. I think this is a pretty high pick and one of the better uncommon cards around, giving it a B. Next up, it's Roots of Wisdom, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says mill 3 cards, then return a land card or elf card from your graveyard to your hand. If you can't, draw a card. So the black-green deck, which is about elves, is also about the graveyard, as this card shows you. This helps you mill yourself, and then you get an elf or land back from the graveyard most of the time. That's the kind of card that is often just a 23rd card in your deck just because it isn't very impactful. It has no impact on the board immediately, and it mostly just gives you some card selection. Think of this as sort of a green anticipate. I do like that you get to draw a card if you can't get a land or elf, which means that you don't have to have a huge number of elves for it to be kind of okay. I do kind of wish that it would let you make a choice. Like if you have an elf and or land in your graveyard, you could still choose to draw if you wanted to, but it doesn't work that way. You only draw if there's nothing to get back. But yeah, like Anticipate and Tormenting Voice and other cards like this, I imagine you'll cut this more than you play it. Frankly, it just doesn't do a whole lot. The graveyard and elf synergy is kind of okay, but nothing special. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Rune of Might, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment or a rune. It has enchant permanent. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. If the enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1 and has trample. And as long as enchanted permanent is an equipment, it has equipped creature, gets +1/+1 and has trample. This is a strictly better Setessan training, and the training was a pretty nice card. Granted, this set is not quite as enchantment focused as Theros Beyond Death, but this still seems pretty good. While a stats boost and trample for 1 and a green can be a really risky aura to play, this draws you a card so you can avoid a total blowout from a 2-for-1 most of the time. Trample is an evasive ability too. It might not be flying, but it does make it harder for your opponent to stop your creatures from damaging them. I think this is one of the better cards in this cycle, with the blue one maybe being the only one that's a little bit better. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Serulf's Packmate, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 wolf at common. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can foretell it for 1 generic and a green. This is a really good common. A 4-mana 3/3 that draws you a card is generally a B-. It's going to give you a 2-for-1 almost every time, especially because the stats it has are actually passable for the mana cost. Then you add Foretold to the mix, which in this case lets you pay for the card in 2 separate installments. You don't pay more or less mana by doing it, and you have a card that is quite flexible. This is a very high quality common, and one you can first pick over most uncommons. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sculptor of Winter, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 snow creature elf rogue at common, and you can tap it to untap target snowland. This seems pretty nice to me. A 2-mana 2/2 is passable, especially with the elf creature type and the snow super type. Both are things that cards in this set care about. And the fact it can untap snowlands is pretty nice too, since it will allow you to ramp and produce 2 snow mana off of 1 snow land, which matters for many cards in this set. Now, you won't always have snow lands, but you will often enough for this to be useful. And it has a fine baseline as a Grizzly Bear. This seems like a quality green common to me. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Snakeskin Veil, which for 1 green mana is a common instant, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control against hexproof until end of turn. This is an okay combat trick, even if it doesn't give the biggest boost ever, even for 1 mana. Basically, with tricks, you're looking for the ones that can do the best job of helping your creature win combat, and you want to do it as efficiently as possible. One usually expects at least a +2/+2 boost from a 1 mana trick, and this does not deliver there. However, it does grant a creature hexproof, and that means that it also has utility outside of combat. Plus, the boost it gives is permanent, so it isn't super far away from +2/+2. Now, I'm not super high on any but the most impressive of combat tricks. They are highly situational, and generally the fewer cards that are situational in your deck, the better. But again, the hexproof aspect does mean you can use this to save a creature from removal too, making it a little less situational. But it's still a trick with significant limitations. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Spirit of the Alder Guard, which for 3 generic and a green is a 0/4 snow creature bear spirit at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a snow land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And Spirit of the Alder Guard gets +1/+0 for each other snow permanent you control. This is a pretty nice card for decks that are either interested in snow or fixing, both of which seem to be what green is interested in this format, so it has that going for it. Now, in terms of fixing, you will need to have picked up snow lands in the draft to really get the full value out of this as a fixer, but that probably won't be a huge problem. There are snow dual lands and basic lands in this set, and searching up dual lands, especially with this, will feel really good. It does have kind of terrible stats on a base level, and I think it's interesting they didn't allow it to count itself. It isn't like a 4 mana 1/4 or 2/4 is crazy, but that may indicate that the snow deck is more powerful than I'm imagining. I think you're generally going to be happy if you can get this to 2/4, and it will get larger than that most of the time, at least by the late game. I don't think you want to first pick this, but it's a nice card. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it is Struggle for Skemfar, which costs 3 generic and a green for a common sorcery. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then that creature fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and it has Foretell for 1 green mana. And while I think Hunt the Weak seems a bit weaker these days than it used to, it was always a solid card. The +1/+1 counter makes it so more of your creatures are capable of killing opposing creatures by fighting them, and yeah, you do have to be super cautious with this, since if your opponent interacts in response, it will be a complete and utter blowout. But it still does a pretty good job at getting creatures out of the way for green decks, and adding Foretell to the mix here is a big deal. This is a card with Foretell that will only cost 3 total mana if you Foretell it, so it's one of the few cards in the set where you get a discount rather than the same cost or a slightly higher cost. And paying only 1 green mana for a fight spell the turn you play it is a pretty big deal. Basically, Struggle for Skemfar is going to make it so you can do a whole lot with your mana, and 3 mana for this effect, even though it's still a little bit dangerous as a sorcery that fights and all of that, I think it makes it up into the lower range of premium removal thanks to the efficiency that Foretell allows for here, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Toski, Bearer of Secrets, which for 3 generic and a green is a 1/1 legendary creature squirrel at rare. It can't be countered, it has indestructible, and it attacks each combat if able, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. This is a legendary squirrel, which seems pretty silly, but believe it or not, it's actually based on Norse mythology. But it also has a pretty cool design. It's kind of like a green Bident of Thassa with a body. That type of draw a card effect for each creature that does combat damage to a player is very strong and can really snowball things for you in a hurry. The more cards you draw, the more creatures you can play who will draw you more cards when they hit your opponent. Toski isn't easy to kill either, meaning the effect will normally stick around. Now, you do need some board presence for Toski to be great, but at least Toski can block whatever it wants on the first turn before attacking every turn after that. This card will take over games thanks to the cards you get though, and while it needs a little too much help to be a straight up bomb, it gets pretty close. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Tyvar Kell, who for 2 generic and 2 green is a legendary planeswalker, Tyvar at Mythic Rare. He gives all elves you control the ability to tap for 1 black mana, and then he has 3 loyalty abilities. The +1 ability says, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target elf, untap it, against Death Touch until end of turn. He has a 0 loyalty ability that makes a 1/1 elf warrior creature token, and he has a -6 ability with, you get an emblem with, whenever you cast an elf spell, it gains haste until end of turn, and you draw 2 cards. So, obviously enough, Tyvar will excel in decks with a ton of elves, but one of the nice things about him is he isn't completely reliant on your deck having like 10 or more. This is because he can make elves himself with his 0 loyalty ability. Those elves can protect him, and because of his static ability, they can also tap for black mana. Once you have elves, he can put counters on them, untap them, and give them death touch with the +1, and obviously his -6 does kind of ask you to have a ton of elves, but you won't often get there. Basically, I think your average green deck in this format will have no problem having like 5 or so elves, and he's going to be a good card in those decks. Then if you have 10 or more, he gets really silly. He's basically a bomb in a card that has 10 or more elves, and in a deck with like 5 elves, he's probably a B-, and I think sort of splitting the difference there and giving him a B+, which means you first pick him most of the time you see him anyway, is probably the right thing to do. And our last green card is Voron Klex Monstrous Raider, who for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It has Trample and Haste, and it says, if you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. It also says, if an opponent would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. So, I'm already on board with a 6 mana 6/6 with Trample and Haste. It's like a B-. It is very likely to get in for damage before it can be removed, and if it doesn't get removed, it will do a whole lot more than that. On top of that, you have some counter payoffs going on here, and you also hose your opponent's counters, and while counters aren't like all over the place in this set, as we've seen in this video, they're around, and this will also work with the poison counters, which is kind of fun. He also helps you get through your sagas more quickly, while basically turning off your opponent's sagas. So, he will have an impact on the game counter-wise, but more often than not, I think being a 6 mana 6/6 with Trample and Haste will be the biggest part of the card. I do think he stops short of being a straight-up bomb. If this set had more counter stuff going on, he probably would be, but as is, I think he's a B+. Well, those are all the green cards in Kaldheim. Now that we've looked at all the monocolored cards in this set, it's time to look at everything else. Tomorrow, I'll be back to look at multicolored and colorless cards. By the way, if you want to buy any of the cards in this video, I have good news. You can pre-order Kaldheim at Card Kingdom. If you use my referral link in the description, you'll be taken right to their store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it, as that makes it more likely other people will enjoy it too. If you want to stay up to date as my set review continues, and as I start doing draft videos of this format, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you need to catch up on the earlier videos in this review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.